Okay, I've got my Eachine E129 micro heli out here. Session 2 with the Radio Master TX16S. And I wanted to show you, I have my momentary switch. My momentary switch is set up to reset my timer, and I went ahead and set that up also as my emergency stop. I figure if I'm going to use an emergency stop, I'm probably not concerned about the timer. On the 2-position switch on the top left hand, SF, I have that set up for my 1-key takeoff and 1-key land. So for my 1-key takeoff, I just pull it forward, and then 1-key land, I just push it back into the original position again. Now remember, in order for the 1-key takeoff to work, you have to set your throttle at 50%, right? Otherwise it'll just spin up and then spin right back down again if you're not at 50% throttle. So let's go ahead and do our 1-key takeoff, make sure everything's working as it should. Okay, and we're in the air with our 1-key takeoff. Okay, now what I'm going to do is push that switch forward for 1-key land. And there we go, 1-key land. And it shuts down. Okay, now I'm going to put the throttle back in the 50%. 1-key takeoff again, and we're in the air. And I like the amount of expo I have set up. My dual rates I've got set up for 100% on all axis, aileron, elevator, rudder, and then I just have my expo set up to make them nice and smooth. So I'm happy with that. I'm happy with the way it flies. So I am going to be publishing group 6 of my model files here pretty soon. Okay, so now what I want to do, let me put it back in the air. Come on. Put it back in the air, and I'm going to get close to the ground, and then I'm going to hit my kill switch. Alright, there we go. There's the kill switch. So, 1-key takeoff, the kill switch is working fine. And I'll talk about the bind switch when we get back. I also set up a switch for binding to it. But I couldn't really see any difference between, the individual channels set up for trims over the normal trim that you have on the elevator, aileron, and rudder. So I'm going to remove that programming from the transmitter. I can't see any benefit to it. This model is like all the other micro, gyro, ready-to-fly planes that I have. If you have too much trim in it, either it will not bind, or if it binds, it will not arm. Now, I found in the past that it does that even with sub trim. So what I found was if I'm 8 points or higher on my sub trim, it'll bind, but it will not arm. So keep that in mind. If you have too much trim or too much sub trim, either it will not bind, or if it binds, it will not arm until you remove that, until you get that trim down below 8. I'm going by memory, so that may not be exact, but that's the number that I have in my head that I remember is 8 points. If it's 8 points or higher, it will not arm. So I know the helicopter is the same way. If I put in a bunch of trim, I tested that out. If I put in a bunch of trim, it will not bind. And once I take the trim back out of it, it binds up fine. Now, if you have to put in a bunch of trim, chances are you need to recalibrate the gyro anyway, right? So, anyway, let's go ahead and put our throttle at 50% and flip our switch back for 1-key takeoff. And it just works like the 2-position switch just works like a simple button. So, it's either on or off, you know what I mean? And that works just fine. So whatever position you have your switch in, your 2-position switch for takeoff, and then just push the switch back in the opposite direction for your 1-key land, and it works just fine. No problems with it whatsoever. Oh, and I also found in RC groups the guru, Pascal, that does the programming for a lot of this stuff for the multi-module. So what I was wondering about last time I had it out was the rates on the helicopter. What channel are the rates on? Okay, so according to him, and he's the one that knows, all these models will be in high rate mode all the time, and so you have dual rate and expo if you want to tone it down. But it should, all these models should always be in high rate mode when you're flying them, when you're binding up to them with the multi-module. So I was curious about that because I couldn't find any documentation on it, and so that's the case. So it is always in high rate mode. And I wasn't sure about that. Now this morning we just have about 3 or 4 mile per hour wind. I'm pushing into the wind right now, and it's pushing against a 3 to 4 mile per hour wind just fine. I think the most wind I've flown this in so far was 4 to 6 with gusts to 8 miles per hour every once in a while, and I handled it just fine. So, if it was a steady 8 miles per hour wind, then you might have some problems. But 4 to 6 with gusts to 8, I had no problem whatsoever. And look how smooth that is, man. This is an exceptional beginner helicopter to begin with, but pairing it up with a hobby grade transmitter makes it even easier to fly. I mean, so much easier to fly because the controls are so much smoother. The yaw rate is so much smoother. The throttle, especially, there's so much resolution on the throttle compared to the stock transmitter. It actually took me a flight to get used to the throttle because there's so much more resolution on it, and it makes it a lot easier to maintain your altitude, I think, even more so than the altitude hold does. Having that much resolution on the throttle just makes it awesome. But yeah, man, I can't say enough good things about, I'm running into myself, I can't say enough good things about this helicopter bound up to this TX16S. I mean, now it flies and it feels like a much, much larger helicopter, that's for sure. And it's awesome. And I don't know if you guys have watched the load tests that I've done on this, but it was able to carry 5.2 grams of additional weight without too much of a problem. So you could definitely FPV this micro helicopter with an all-in-one FPV camera, which I may very well do. I just think that it would be so cool flying this around in my backyard via FPV. I mean, wouldn't that be cool? So when I have time to sit down and solder up a pigtail on the main board and figure out a mount for the FPV camera, I think I'm definitely at least going to attempt to put an FPV camera on this. But look how smooth. That is just, it's awesome. And if you're really hot, you can use it as a fan, if you hover over yourself. But such a cool little micro helicopter. And I haven't flown it in a while, so it's one of those deals where you got to get used to that much resolution on the throttle again, because remember, it's a beginner helicopter, and so when you're decreasing your throttle, there's a little bit of lag time. It doesn't descend quickly, and it doesn't ascend quickly. So you got to remember that. You got to remember to give yourself a little room for those altitude changes, and that takes some getting used to when you have so much more resolution on the throttle. But absolutely fantastic little helicopter. And like I said, I am definitely a beginner when it comes to helicopters. It's only recently that I have been reviewing these micro helicopters, and it has literally been years since I had flown one of these micro helicopters. And it's very different. You know, it's very different than flying a plane. It's very different than flying a quadcopter. It's kind of, it almost feels like something in between the two, you know? But so smooth, and you know, it's very agile too, for as tiny as it is. And it can handle some wind, which really surprised me. But isn't that smooth now? I mean, that is awesome. And it's pretty fast. I have a hard time. I have a hard time slowing this down. I have a hard time slowing everything down that I fly. I'm not known for being, you know, easy on the throttle. So to fly it smoothly, it takes a little bit of finesse on the controls, which, you know, is hard for me to do. But you certainly can, with a little practice, fly it extremely smooth. Isn't that awesome? I've got my timer set for 9 minutes. And when you're flying this little helicopter, you'd be surprised at how quickly 9 minutes goes. So I would definitely, you know, if you guys don't have this already, you're thinking about getting it, get the, what is it, 3 or 4 battery version. you know, and it's usually less expensive if you buy the batteries with the product than to buy the batteries later on. So I always go for the maximum amount of batteries that are offered with the ready-to-fly versions of these aircraft, whether it's a helicopter, plane, quadcopter, whatever. It'll cost more up front, but you know, when you come out here and you start flying it, and you've only got 1 or 2 battery packs, you're going to be buying additional battery packs. I'd rather pay the additional cost up front and save money on down the road, you know. But yeah, you're gonna want multiple packs. But absolutely fun little micro helicopter, and the wind's starting to pick up a bit now too. But if you look at how of course I've got more practice with it now too. But if you look at how I was flying it with the stock transmitter, and then how I'm flying it now with the hobby grade transmitter, you can see that it's a lot easier for me to maintain my altitude with the hobby grade transmitter than it was the stock transmitter, because you just don't have as much resolution on the throttle, and I was constantly having to descend. Yeah, well, the wind did really. Parking my truck on the opposite side of this dirt lane now as a reminder to myself where the sun is located, because I come out here early in the morning before the wind builds, and the sun is always low in the sky. So it's really easy to forget where it is and fly an aircraft right across it, and you know, the aircraft that I just crashed. Beautiful, beautiful aircraft. And out of the end of the sun, the aircraft was mostly white. It's very reflective, and so when I flew it right next to the sun, I could not even see it anymore. Nosed it in, tore it up. So I don't want to do that anymore. Okay. I don't know how much time we've been in the air now. But let's go ahead and land. I'm going to land manually this time. Go ahead and land, and then I will meet you back at the hangar, and I'll discuss the bind button with you, and I don't know what else. We'll think of something else, information I need to give you. I'll see you back at the hangar.
Okay, so fantastic flight with this little Eachine E129 paired up with the TX16 transmitter. I have absolutely no complaints whatsoever. I mean, it is an awesome plane, a little helicopter, you know, especially on a hobby grade transmitter where you've got tons of resolution and you can set your expo up the way you want. Fantastic. I absolutely love it. The one thing I want to tell you about also is I do have a bind switch set up for this too, so you don't have to go into the menu to bind. And I have switch SE set up for my bind switch. It's a 3-position switch, but I just use the center position. I have it programmed on channel 16. From what I've read on a lot of these protocols, channel 16 seems to be the channel that most of these aircraft use if you have a bind on by channel, bind on channel checked in the menu, the model menu on the TX16S and open TX. So I just program the 3-button switch so that when I move it to the center position, it automatically sets the transmitter to bind. But it only works once. That's one thing I found out. I don't know if it's the way the helicopter, the way the protocol works. But when if I power up the transmitter and then I power up the aircraft and then I move my SE switch to the center position, it binds just fine. And then I just flip it back. But if I leave the radio on and then change out the battery on the helicopter and then push my bind switch up again, it doesn't do anything. So I don't know if it just does that the first time, because after you do it the first time, then the protocol's loaded and it doesn't need to bind again since the protocol's already loaded. But then it doesn't bind to the helicopter. Now for me that's not a big deal, because when I'm done flying, after I've flown a battery pack and I've landed, you know, I pull the battery pack out of the aircraft, I power off the transmitter, I check everything out on the aircraft to make sure everything's good to go before I put another battery pack in it, and I like to let it set for 5 or 6 minutes to let the motor and the ESC cool down before I power it back up again. So, you know, then I'm powering my transmitter back on, putting the flight battery in, and I'm up and flying again. But I do that every time, no matter what aircraft I'm flying, so that's not a big deal, but I wanted to make you guys aware of it. I don't know if that's if that's an open TX thing, or if it's a protocol thing, you know, for the E129 protocol, but it only works when you've powered up your transmitter. But anyway, it makes it so that I can just flip a switch and bind to it without having to go into the menu and select bind, so, and then exit out of the menu. So it's a faster way of doing it, and I have it programmed in here. So I want to make you aware of it, so you wouldn't think there was, you know, it's not working because it worked the first time and it's not working the second time. Okay, but anyway, I'll have links to the helicopter in the show notes, a link to this absolutely fantastic transmitter in the show notes. I think I've got spare parts, links to spare parts listed in the show notes too. Fantastic little helicopter, and like I said, it can carry 5.2 grams pretty comfortably, so it's definitely a good candidate for setting up for FPV. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the air.